This video contains detailed descriptions of real-life violence, murder, and forensic investigation. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Some content may be disturbing to sensitive audiences. Please proceed with caution. On August 17, 2019, a resident of Negovan, a small rural village outside Bulgaria's capital, Sofia, ventured to a remote area just outside the village with his girlfriend for some early morning fishing. The couple enjoyed their morning and began their walk back into the village. While walking toward Negovan, the boyfriend came across an object on the shore of a small pond. It had the distinct appearance of a human skull wrapped in plastic with remnants of human hair on it. He also saw what looked to be pieces of a human leg. The police and forensic specialists were quick to arrive and confirmed that the remains were human. The police took to the pond and surrounding waterways in their boats to search for additional remains and likewise deployed sniffer dogs to the area. Lastly, divers were sent to search the bottom of the pond. The police soon found the rest of the heavily decomposed body, some pieces in plastic bags and others in a drum/barrel. The remains had been dismembered, and the body belonged to a woman who had likely died a while ago. The search continued, and only a few meters from the first body, the police came across a second. This body had also been dismembered, wrapped in plastic and sealed in a drum. This body was also highly decomposed and had likely been killed a while ago. A complete body was recovered from both of them. The barrels had a small tear/opening and the pond wasn't too deep, so stray dogs managed to get inside of them and scatter the remains, which was how the couple found the skull as opposed to both bodies being sunk to the bottom. When the dogs and divers were finished their search, over 3 barrels and 5 plastic bags containing the body parts that hadn't been scattered were pulled from the pond. Alongside the body parts, their clothing and belongings were within the bags and barrels. According to some sources and a criminologist, this was the first case in Bulgaria's modern history where 2 victims were dismembered in a single incident. Given how small Negovan was, it was easy to verify that none of the local residents were missing. Therefore, the killers and victims were likely from outside the village, killed elsewhere and disposed of in Negovan to make it harder to link the crime to them. So the police walked along the surrounding villages to ask the locals if any of them had gone missing. The answer was no, but just to be safe, the police took DNA samples from the local residents to compare against the bodies. None of the samples were a match. The police then conducted another extensive search to find any physical evidence that could identify the victims. The search lasted for over 8 hours. In so doing, the police came across a carpet, possibly used to wrap the victims' bodies, a purse with a few coins but no identification, and some shell casings. Forensic experts spent 12 hours carefully reassembling the bodies and matching each part to each victim. When it was done, the second body was determined to belong to an elderly man in his 65 to 75, while the female body was much younger, either 45 to 55. With this, the police believed they were likely related, possibly father and daughter. It was also concluded that both had been dead for approximately 2 months. A revised autopsy later concluded that the woman was around the same age as the man, meaning that instead, they were likely siblings or husband and wife. As for the cause of death, the police found bullets at the scene, and the forensic experts found wounds on both bodies. The man had been shot twice in the head, and the woman had also been shot once. The woman had died instantly from only 1 gunshot wound to the back of the head, while the man had been shot twice in the back of his head and suffered an instant death as well. Based on the wounds, they had likely been shot at very close range. Initially, the police were optimistic that the case might have been solved without them knowing. The well-executed gun shots at close range, the dismemberment, the drums/barrels and sinking at the bottom of the river, all seemed to point to organized crime. Bulgaria had a decent amount of mobsters convicted of murders, even in the absence of the body, with the remains being found years later. Maybe the killer was already serving a life sentence for this very murder, with the police only needing to identify the victims. They also found fragments of metal at the scene, which the medical examiner ruled to be pieces of a knife. The dismemberment was not the work of professionals, and based on the rough cuts, they did not use sophisticated or high-end tools. The unprofessional nature of the killing caused the organized crime theory to slowly lose its credibility. Instead, it looked like the murder was far more personal, such as jealousy or a love triangle gone wrong. Perhaps they had been killed by their relatives, which would also explain why no one had reported the two missing. After rumors and speculation, many had wondered about a third victim, so the police returned to the pond on August 19 to thoroughly look into that claim. After a long search, they concluded that there were only two bodies. The police took the victim's DNA but had no matches on file. Next, 12 hours were spent going through missing person records all over Bulgaria, but we found nobody to match the victim's description. They took this to mean that the killer or killers likely knew the two well and didn't want anyone looking for them. Alongside their clothes, the police found a pair of keys belonging to an old Peugeot or Renault car manufactured between 1996 and 2004 was found with the victims. They likely drove the vehicle, so the police went through the vehicle registration records to see who owned such a vehicle. Meanwhile, the clothing itself wasn't anything too distinctive. The women's blouse was manufactured in Bulgaria by a Dimitrovgrad company 4 to 5 years ago, the men's shorts are a Turkish brand, and the underwear was made in China. All of them were fairly cheap and could easily be found at any market in Bulgaria. By August 22, the victims were still unidentified, so the police began publishing photos of their clothing and belongings to the public, the articles consisting of blouses, trousers, slippers, shirts and car keys. Then, they simply waited for someone to see and recognize them. The police admitted in a press conference that the clothes may not belong to them and were merely placed there to mislead the investigators but figured that it'd still be helpful if someone recognized them. Unfortunately, news was still slow to trickle in. Undeterred, the police continued their efforts. The police reviewed over 11,000 transactions for concluded contracts for properties sold by elderly people. Next, they conducted an analysis of unclaimed pensions for the last 4 months, giving them 11 potential leads. One by one, they were all ruled out. Lastly, they did another search for all missing elderly couples in Bulgaria. Next, they looked into the possibility that the victims were foreign nationals, maybe even residing in Bulgaria illegally, which would be another valid explanation for why nobody reported the two missing. They failed to make any headway with this theory either. The key to finally solving the case came from the drums/barrels themselves. The 3 white barrels were 80-liter ones manufactured in neighboring Romania as opposed to being mass-produced from a manufacturing hub. Also, the killers must not have noticed the label and serial number still inscribed on them. The police traced it to the company that imported them into Bulgaria and which stores sold them. They were mostly sold to construction companies or construction workers. With this, the police managed to trace them to the exact store in question. They were sold at a hardware store located in a small village known as Svitovrachin, a 4-minute drive from Negovan. There, they spoke with the employees. The employees showed them the CCTV footage from the purchase. The footage showed 2 men walking in, buying the drums, loading them into their vehicle and driving off. The cameras also captured the vehicle the two had used, a Jeep Grand Cherokee SUV. The purchase was made on July 14, 2019. The police identified the two as construction workers, 44-year-old Georgy Nanchev and 39-year-old Playman Shlyapashki. But still, they didn't have enough to arrest them right away. After all, someone could have simply stolen the drums. So for now, the police merely placed them under surveillance. In the meantime, aside from Playman's conviction, their background seemed unassuming, not at all the types of people to carry out such a crime. Little information exists on either of their childhood, but Georgy, alongside his job as a construction worker, worked as a home renovation specialist. He developed a reputation as a skilled craftsman, and thus many sought to hire him whenever possible. In fact, he was reputable enough that in July 2019, someone from England had offered him a job. Georgy was also a married man and had a daughter. With his family, he lived in the Druzhba neighborhood of Sofia. Neighbors described him as a sociable person who enjoyed spending time in the gazebo in front of his apartment building. He barely drank, and did his job responsibly, and no one who knew him could recall a single time in which he caused any problems or issues. Although he had never been convicted of any crimes, he was listed in Bulgaria's Ministry of Interior's database, meaning that they had looked into him for something. He lived a mostly carefree life and was passionate about fishing and traveling across Bulgaria. Oddly, in the months preceding the discovery of the bodies, he was talking about how he planned to purchase an apartment for €70,000, something way beyond his means and unaffordable with his current salary. Meanwhile, Playman was born in a town called Biala Slatina but had been living in Sofia for many years by this point. Like Georgi, he had a stable family consisting of a wife and 2 children. Just like Georgi, he also lived in the Druzhba neighborhood. For a brief period, he worked abroad in Milan, Italy, before finally returning to Bulgaria. Alongside his odd jobs in the construction industry, Playman found employment at the Technical University in Sofia, although what exactly he did at the university isn't specified. Playman seemed to have an interest in motorcycles and, forebodingly, crime films. It's also not specified if he was as respected as Georgi, but considering his criminal record, the answer was likely no. On April 23, 2012, Playman was arrested for shooting a dog with a gas pistol in the Druzhba neighborhood after it had bitten him. The pistol in question he illegally modified to fire live ammunition, meaning he shot off a firearm at a dog in a residential neighborhood. The Sofia District Prosecutor's Office charged him with illegal possession of a weapon, but since he had a clean criminal record before that point, the courts only let him off with a suspended sentence. It is unclear if the dog survived or not. The two met in either 2016 or 2017 during renovation work at a hotel in Sofia. The two almost immediately hit it off and became close friends. The two decided to become partners and often found themselves working on the same projects. By August 27, the police had yet to identify their victims but were ready to arrest Georgi and Playman at a moment's notice. But on that same day, they would finally get an answer to the second half of the mystery. The names of their John and Jane Doe. A Bulgarian woman, living in Lagos, Nigeria with her Nigerian husband and their 3 children had grown worried. She had in fact spent an entire month constantly worried. Ever since she left Bulgaria she would speak with her parents on a regular basis but now, she wasn't able to reach them. She spent a month thinking there must have been an innocent explanation but by now, she had to take action. She called one of her friends and asked her to check on them. There she went to the home of 75-year-old Iordan Antanisov and his wife, 70-year-old Mariana Antanisov. The couple had been living together at an apartment on Vito Shah Boulevard in the Ivan Vazov neighborhood in Sofia, a fairly affluent area of the city. The apartment was mostly empty, their car was not parked outside and not even the couple's golden retriever was anywhere to be found. The apartment seemed completely desolate. She soon called their daughter who arranged a flight to Bulgaria immediately. Next, she called the police to report them missing. The police arrived and searched the apartment. Their dwelling was spotless and they saw no signs of a struggle or a break-in. That being said, they still believed a robbery had likely occurred. Their valuable gold jewelry, watches, coins and postage stamps were all missing. The police did recover a bank deposit but it was out of the way and likely missed by whoever was responsible. When the neighbors saw police officers outside and going in and out of the apartment, only then did it hit the other residents that they hadn't seen Iordan and Mariana in quite some time. They had somehow gone missing and nobody came forward or felt concerned. Because of this, the police got conflicting reports on the last time anybody saw them. For starters, every day, the neighbors would see them take their dog out for a walk but none could recall the last time that had happened. Some said that the last time they saw them was on July 8, at a funeral. Meanwhile, some who were friends of theirs said that they last saw the two at a funeral of 3 months ago. No evidence in the apartment, disjointed witness testimony and a month, possibly a 2-month-long gap between whatever happened and the first report being filed. This would be detrimental if the police were investigating their disappearance as a distinct case. But they weren't. Almost immediately they made the connection to the bodies in Negovan. The two went missing at a time roughly aligning with the medical examiner's time of death, and they were the same age as the victims. Once their daughter landed in Bulgaria on August 28, the police arranged for her to view all the clothing and the car keys. There, she identified the victim's clothing as her parents' and that the car keys were those of the vehicle that the two drove. The police lastly took a sample of her DNA to compare against the victim's. After 11 days, the bodies in Negovan were finally identified as Iordan and Mariana, an identification that made this case one of Bulgaria's most high-profile in recent memory. Details on Mariana are very sparse. All that seems to be known is that she was a retired teacher. Most of this case's infamy stems from her husband, Iordan. Iordan was a local celebrity, and even before the murder itself, newspapers from other countries would talk about him. He was well known amongst the Bulgarian public. While little information exists on Iordan's childhood, his adult life was highly publicized. Iordan worked as a wrestling coach, initially at the Sofia Club Academic, where he trained the local youth. Starting in the 1980s, he got promoted and began coaching at Olympic Hopes, a prestigious sports school in Sofia. Iordan had trained many other well-known wrestlers in Bulgaria. It was said that he personally coached Vasil Aliyev, although he's more well-known for being an infamous crime boss than his wrestling career, and Stefan Miroslavov. Other people he trained at Olympic Hopes were Nigerian students who left for camps in Bulgaria. This inspired Iordan to take jobs outside of Bulgaria, and the bulk of his work took place overseas. Alongside working in the United States, he once coached Saudi Arabia's national wrestling team and was, for a brief period, the head of Nigeria's wrestling team. Nigeria would go on to mark a controversy in his career. In 2001, the Nigerian national wrestling team participated in the World Championships held in Iordan's native Bulgaria, and so when a minor scandal involving him became public, the media in both countries began reporting on it. The Secretary-General of the Nigerian Wrestling Federation, a man named Josephat Oki, had suddenly made an attempt to revoke Iordan's rights to coach the team. Then, on December 8, 2001, he wrote a letter to Nigeria's immigration department to get Iordan and his assistant Stoyan Panov deported. He accused Iordan of spending and wasting unnecessarily large sums of money to bring two competitors to the championship. Despite his best efforts, Iordan was not reported, nor was he kicked off the team. He then went on to coach other well-known wrestlers such as Olympic gold medalist Daniel Igali. Helping him train Daniel was Stoyan Panov. When Stoyan died on July 28, 2019, Daniel even made a statement mourning him. By 2019, the two had mostly retired and moved into the apartment. In 2016, Iordan had made enough money coaching foreign wrestling teams that he was, in fact, able to live comfortably. The couple even sold a house not long before their disappearance. And speaking of the disappearance, the neighbors provided an explanation for why it took so long to notice. The neighbors described the two as quite closed and unsociable. That's not to say they fought with their neighbors, just that they hardly interacted with them. The only exception was when they filed noise complaints with the apartment upstairs. They also avoided Mariana, who had an irritable personality and hardly ever left the apartment due to severe leg pain. Meanwhile, Iordan often bragged about how much money he made from his career in Nigeria, but he seemed frugal and content to live a quiet life alone with Mariana. In a bout of good timing, the police that had been surveilling Georgi and Playman decided to make their move just slightly before the positive identification was made. Georgi and Playman were arrested in Jurovo, a small village in the Pravets municipality. The two were arrested at a construction site where they were currently working. The two quietly surrendered once they saw police surrounding the site. After their arrest, the two initially tried shifting the blame onto each other before both of them finally confessed. Had Iordan and Mariana been reported missing sooner, the two would have been arrested sooner. The surveillance team noticed the two going to the couple's apartment at various points during the 6 days they had been following them, but never entering the building itself. At the time, they didn't know who lived at that apartment or had any reason to assume they weren't just going there to work. Georgi knew Iordan and Mariana almost 15 years before the murder, so the couple trusted him on a personal level. He met the two when they hired him to paint their apartment in Sofia. They liked his work, so they hired him again, and again until, over time, he became their go-to whenever their homes needed any work done. They trusted him completely. Their long-term work relationship, one that later became a friendship, meant that Georgie knew a lot about the couple, about their finances, that they owned multiple properties in Sofia and had savings. In early July 2019, Mariana met with Georgie and Playman and gave them another job, installing new windows in their apartment. They accepted the job, and while working, Iordan confided in them about something. He had recently sold another apartment in the Krasno Selo district of Sofia and was frustrated with the bank's low interest rates. Upon hearing this, Georgie and Playman reasoned that the proceeds from this sale might be hidden somewhere in the apartment rather than deposited at their bank. Georgie then concluded that the money they were surely hoarding in the apartment was worth more than his nearly two-decade-long friendship and proposed a plan to Playman. That they would kill the two and steal their wealth. Playman didn't think it over for even a second and instantly agreed. In another depraved layer to this case, Georgie knew their daughter lived abroad and saw an opportunity in that, since he knew it'd make them more vulnerable and lead to a delay in anyone reporting them missing. And to make it even worse, Georgie had known they were wealthy and had been planning the murder for over a year. Hearing about the sales proceeds simply motivated him to carry out the murder now. While the murder was Georgie's idea, Playman would be the executioner. To prepare for the crime, he purchased a CZ pistol, a silencer and the ammunition to go with the pistol. He paid 1,600 Bulgarian lev for the weapon. With the murder weapon now in their possession, the two simply waited to be hired for another job so they could freely enter the apartment without leaving signs of a break-in. Their next job came on July 14, 2019, when contracted to do more renovations throughout the entire apartment. Not wanting to alert them to their true intentions, the two spent a little while actually doing the renovations. Then, while Playman was working on the balcony, Georgie walked up to him and said two very chilling words, "Act now." Almost robotically, Playman immediately stopped what he was doing, brandished the pistol and turned around. There, he approached Mariana and shot her once in the back of the head, instantly killing her before she even knew what was coming. Playman then turned the gun on Iordan and fired 2 shots toward him, killing the former wrestling coach just as instantly. In less than 10 seconds, Georgie's close friends of 15 years were both dead. Next, they searched the entire apartment from top to bottom, expecting a big payday from the property sale. They missed the banking deposit and only found the gold jewelry, coins, watches, and postage stamps. The total value of all that was stolen amounted to 4,000 to 5,000 lev. They then dragged the two bodies into the bathroom and left them there. They got in their vehicle and drove to the hardware store in Svitovrachin to purchase the plastic bags and the barrels. They went to Svitovrachin rather than making the purchase in Sofia because they thought it'd be harder to link the purchase to them. Once they drove back to Sofia and to the apartment, it was time for the grisly part. First, they tried using scissors to cut off the skin, but that was too slow and inefficient. So then they got out a knife to carry out the dismemberment instead. The first knife did manage to fully dismember Mariana's body, but it had grown too dull and blunt to do the same for Iordan. They had to retrieve another knife, but that one was also very dull already and made the process very slow and rough. It took them over 4 hours to dismember both bodies. The couple's dog was spared in this process as Georgie took pity on the animal. They did not kill it. Once the task was done, they placed the remains in the plastic bags while others went into the barrels. There, they loaded the barrels and the couple's dog into the SUV. They drove around to a neighboring neighborhood and set the dog free before driving around Sofia to think of a spot to dispose of the bodies. First, they considered hiding them at the university and even drove in that direction, but they soon realized that was a bad idea. Then, they remembered Negovan. On their way to Svitovrachin, they had to drive through Negovan and thus saw the pond. Now having an idea spot, they drove to Negovan to barrels and bags into the pond before leaving. Afterward, they returned to the apartment and thoroughly cleaned the entire area with bleach. Next, they took advantage of Playman's job at the technical university. They drove to the university and hid the pistols in a cache in a room in the courtyard. Some of the jewelry was sold at a pawn shop for 900 lev, but not all of it. When the police went to search Playman's home after his arrest, they found his wife wearing Mariana's necklace and bracelet. She said that Playman had given them to her as a gift. She suspected they were stolen and wore them anyway, thinking violence wasn't involved in obtaining them. They then spent their last month of freedom living as if nothing had ever happened. They continued to attend social functions such as evening drinks and neighborhood conversations, and nobody in their lives ever noted anything suspicious or odd about them. If not for the label on the barrels still being legible, they'd have likely gotten away with it. Based on their confessions, the police escorted them under heavy guard. The two were brought to the university. They pointed out to the officers where they had hidden the firearms. They also found the knives and scissors they had used, which had traces of Iordan and Mariana's DNA on them. The case became such a big story that Bulgaria's Prime Minister, Boyko Borisov, was at a meeting with the European Commission when he heard the news that the murder had been solved and the circumstances. He used his time at the meeting to praise Bulgaria's police force. His exact words were, "Perfect job, we catch the murderers before we even know who the victims are." On August 31, the two were brought to the Sofia City Court for their indictment. Georgi and Playman were brought into the court under heavy security and with a crowd of reporters waiting for them, reporters whom the two hid their faces from. The journalists also had their questions go unanswered. When inside the courtroom itself, Playman had nothing to say outside of, "Whatever I say, I know I'm guilty, so I have nothing to say," while Georgi admitted his guilt and expressed remorse for the crime, something they didn't do when arrested. Their court-appointed attorney argued for them to be placed under house arrest while awaiting trial. At the hearing, the two were charged with premeditated murder of more than one person in complicity with the purpose of robbery, and were facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Their lawyer's request for house arrest was denied, and the two were ordered to be held in pretrial detention. The judge cited the violent nature of the crime and the two being a flight risk as the reason behind their decision. Shortly after the hearing's conclusion, a family came forward with an accusation with startling implications. They went to the media, police and the prosecutor's office and confidently stated that Playman had killed before with the victim, their elderly relative. 85-year-old Svetanka Stoyancheva lived with one of her daughters at an apartment in Sofia's Geo-Milev district. Svetanka kept on hand a small fortune of 70,000 euros she obtained from a land sale. She kept the euros on hand as she didn't trust the banks with them. Unfortunately, as a result of her old age, Svetanka suffered from severe dementia and had issues with her orientation, often forgetting where she was. By early 2017, it had gotten so bad that she couldn't even recognize her own relatives. As a result, her family did not allow her to live alone. One of Svetanka's daughters worked as a cleaner at the technical university, which was how she met Playman. When hearing of his other job, she referred Playman to Svetanka, who agreed to let him paint and renovate her apartment. He did this enough times to grow close to the family. He'd often run other errands for them and agreed to stay and watch Svetanka whenever her other relatives absolutely had to be somewhere else. On September 7, 2018, a passerby found Svetanka lying on the street between two cars. Initially thinking that they had found a corpse, he called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and noticed that Svetanka was barely clinging to life, so they quickly had her rushed to the nearest hospital. Upon her arrival, the attending physicians concluded she was suffering from a stroke and kept her in the intensive care unit. They spent a week trying their hardest to save her life, but despite their best efforts, she passed away on September 17. She never regained consciousness. It seemed like a clear-cut natural death, went for a walk alone, got disoriented and suffered a stroke. But almost immediately, her family took note of many bizarre oddities. The first of which, all of that 70,000 euros were missing, nowhere to be found. They also felt the cause of death was odd. She could barely walk by that point and would get lost easily, and yet she found herself outside in that area. But the worst of them all, when they went to pay the last of Svetanka's electricity bill, they were told that there was no need as they weren't the apartment's legal owner. On June 27, 2018, a few months before her death, the apartment had been sold without the knowledge of her family. The sale was made in the name of Petr Petrov, a man from the town of Radomir, with Playman as the proxy. After seeing Playman and Georgie's arrest on the news, they recognized Playman immediately and went to the prosecutor's office. They asked them for permission to exhume her body to check for any drugs or even signs of violence on her remains. The lawyer representing the family said there was a high chance their request would be approved. The prosecutor also said they were looking into other potential victims of the two. There has never been a single update, and neither of the two ever faced any additional charges. It seems as if they concluded that Iordan and Mariana were the pair's only victims. However, both Playman and Petr were charged with fraud regarding the sale of Tsvetanka's apartment. As for those two murders, despite how open and shut the case was and the fact that the two had practically pled guilty, it would drag on for longer than anyone had expected. First of all, the presiding judge had to be excused from the case as she was assigned the role of prosecutor so she could investigate a series of serious, albeit unrelated to the murder, complaints against the case's chief prosecutor and his deputies, meaning a new judge and possibly prosecutor both had to be assigned. All of these procedural setbacks meant that even though the two were indicted on August 31, 2019, the court didn't hold its first preliminary hearing until January 31, 2024, with the trial itself finally beginning on April 3 of that year. Even putting aside their confessions, the prosecution had an airtight case. They went into court armed with forensic evidence linking Georgie and Playman to the apartment and the pond in Negovan, ballistic reports and evidence connecting the recovered firearms to Iordan and Mariana's wounds, phone and electronic records tracing their movements that day, witness testimony who saw them at the apartment, the extensive premeditation involved and the receipt from when Playman purchased the pistols. Their confessions were just the cherry on top. They were seeking the maximum sentence Bulgarian law allowed, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. All the defense could do was try and highlight the mitigating factors in hopes of reducing their sentence. It was pointed out that the two confessed and were cooperative, had taken full responsibility and expressed remorse, aided in the investigation by helping them find vital evidence, and that Georgie specifically had a clean record and reputation before the murder. On August 15, 2024, a 5-member panel of judges at the Sofia City Court reached their conclusion. Georgie Nanchev and Playman Shlyapashki were both found guilty of the murders of Iordan Atanasov and Mariana Atanasov. They were also ordered to pay their family 300,000 lev in compensation. However, they rejected the prosecutor's request and instead took the mitigating factors into account and handed down an ordinary life sentence, meaning that parole would technically be on the table after enough time had passed. Both sides were given a 15-day window to appeal the sentence before it became final. Both announced their intention to do so, but there have been no updates. Iordan and Mariana's daughter, much like her father, was deeply respected in her own field. She studied as a neurologist and went to medical school in Bulgaria before leaving for Nigeria to live with her father. There she met her future husband and stayed behind with him, and started a family. In Nigeria, she was the deputy director of the American school in Lagos. And is a deeply respected figure. She expressed her wishes to have the bodies of her parents returned to Nigeria. She said that her father would have loved to be buried in the country he loved. If this story moved you or made you think, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.